From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, November 1st. The Portland area found itself in the national spotlight this week for a not particularly flattering reason: repeated arson attacks on ballot boxes. We'll be going over what we know about those incidents, but first we're going to take a close look at the many races this year for a spot in Portland City Hall. This massive governance shift approved by voters 2 years ago has really upended how campaigning for city council and mayor works, with some pretty interesting results. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
And I'm OPB Portland Politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
Alex, I feel like you and I have talked a lot on this podcast about these huge shifts coming to Portland's government. You know, the city council is expanding from 5 members to 12. 3 commissioners will be elected to each of 4 new geographic districts within the city. And Portland voters will now be able to rank their favorite candidates in order of preference rather than just picking a single person. I think that is most of it. Those are obviously big changes. And so it's not surprising, I guess, that they would result in some pretty huge changes in what it looks like to run for office. You recently talked to a boatload, I guess is the technical term, of candidates and consultants, and came away with, it feels like, a few major takeaways, right? Maybe the first being that this is kind of ushering in a new sense of camaraderie in Portland among candidates.
Yeah, and it's all because of the new voting system you mentioned, ranked choice voting. As a reminder, this didn't come out of thin air. Like you mentioned, ranked choice voting is something Portlanders voted to adopt 2 years ago. So under city council races, voters are electing 3 people to represent each district, and those 3 will be elected on a single ballot where voters rank candidates based on their preference. I won't get into the way these votes are counted the back end, since we've dug into that more than we need to on this podcast. But I will tell you that it means that voters' choice for second or third may count just as much as who they rank first. So candidates are tapping into that. They're banking on the idea that running in collaboration with essentially their opponents in a district will boost their chances of winning a seat. I should mention that there is some proof of this strategy working. Ireland has been using this kind of ranked choice voting for more than 100 years, where they elect multiple people on a single ballot. And according to people who've researched this system, collaboration on the campaign trail seems to help get people into office there. But it's definitely new to see in Portland.
Well, and you've been speaking with some of the people who are entering into, I guess, these arrangements, these friendships, whatever you want to call them. I mean, what does it look like on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wholesome. Candidates are hosting campaign parties together. I saw one having like a karaoke party together.
Oh, nice.
They're distributing each other's flyers when they go door to door. They're wearing each other's swag. One of the candidates I spoke with is Candace Avalos. She's running in District 1 in Portland's East Side. And she's been collaborating with another D1 candidate named Steph Routh. They're in agreement on most political stances, so it's not hard for them to support each other. Here's what Avalos told me.
The voters ask us, they're like, well, if I can pick, 6, like who else should I pick,
Right.
And so they definitely ask, and her and I have for sure been like, we'll talk each other up.
So it's something that voters who are using this newfangled kind of voting for the first time, they really want help with, and they're asking candidates, please tell me who else should I be voting for? There's too many people to pick from.
Right. Yeah, actually, I just, before we sat down here, I checked I have an email that shows me what mail I'll be getting that day.
Oh,
You can do that. Yeah. And I am getting a flyer today from 2 3rd district candidates, Angelita Murillo and Tiffany Yamalane, who have teamed up like this and are saying, make us your 1 and 2. So it seems like a lot of these pairs cropping up. Obviously, as you say, it feels like a very nice thing, probably something that's pretty palatable to voters who are sick of a toxic and cynical negative campaign cycle like we're seeing in a lot of other races. I was struck, though, in your story that at least one of the people you spoke with thought that there also is a downside to all this sort of kumbaya-ing.
Yeah, that's Eric Zimmerman, who is a candidate in District 4 on Portland's west side. So like Avalos, he has buddied up with another like-minded candidate in his district, and they're doing the kind of partnered campaigning. But he raised concerns about the feel-good system. He said that the absence of negative campaigning could be a disservice to voters because it might ignore some truths about candidates that need to be aired, that sometimes negative ads are important. Another downside that's been well reported on is that candidates are so willing to support each other that they may be ignoring election laws. A few months ago, we saw an email chain between candidates where they were pledging to reciprocate any donations made to their campaign to help each other qualify for the city's donation matching program. The Secretary of State's office has gotten involved. They're now investigating whether this is legal, but it shows that just getting too cozy with other candidates in the spirit of this election could be risky.
Yeah, getting carried away with ourselves a little bit and all this. This election, I think, is almost certainly the most bewildering city council election any Portland voter has ever seen. It certainly is for me. And that's because, with 12 truly open seats, there are just this overwhelming amount of candidates to wade through. You and I, Alex, both live in Portland's 3rd district, where there are, I believe, 30 candidates vying for these 3 seats. But it's not just that there are so many candidates, right? It's that, you wrote about this issue that candidates just also aren't able to spend what candidates might normally spend to introduce themselves to voters.
Yeah, and that's due to unexpected limits to the city's donation matching program that I mentioned earlier. That program rewards candidates who promise to accept only individual campaign donations below $350, so nothing above that. The reward is that the city will match the first $20 of all donations 9-1. So, for example, that turns a $20 donation into $180. Nearly half of all candidates are using this program. I should mention candidates who aren't using this program also have contribution limits. They can't collect more than $579 from individual donors, which isn't a ton more, and it's kind of the trade-off for not getting any free money from the city. But back to this matching program, it isn't limitless. It has a ceiling. In the past, the city would stop matching donations after it's given city council candidates $300,000 in matching funds. But this election cycle, because of budget cuts, the city can only offer up to $120,000 max. And that's only for people who've collected the max amount of individual donations. This might sound like a lot of money still, but in terms of campaign cash, it's really not.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, past elections, city council members are running citywide. Now we're running within a district. Theoretically, there's fewer voters you need to talk to. But what you have heard loud and clear from these candidates, it is not enough. And so, they are trying to get their names and sales pitch in front of voters with some very limited resources. What are the strategies? How are they doing it?
Yeah, they're running really bare bones campaigns. Eric Zimmerman, the candidate I mentioned earlier, he opted to not hire a campaign manager to save money, which leaves that job up to him. And he's a person who also has another full-time job. Other people are making the kind of executive decisions to just not spend money on classic campaigning things like yard signs or ads on social media. And some people are using kind of the buddy-buddy campaigning strategy that we talked about earlier to save money. For example, I spoke with James Armstrong, who's a candidate in North Portland's District 2. He told me that it could bankrupt his campaign, essentially, to send out enough campaign mailers to voters in his district to really get his name out there. So he instead partnered up with another candidate, kind of like what you said found in your mailbox this morning, another candidate, Mike Marshall, to buy and send mailers that has Armstrong's info on one side and Marshall's on the other side. And then they split the bill. It's $50,000 to send those out, and they were able to cut that in half. So people are getting creative.
And this has also introduced something to Portland's system. We are recording this on Halloween, maybe something a little sinister, maybe something people don't really like, but something that a factor that is often a huge piece in competitive federal races, which are independent expenditure committees.
Yes, and I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with the Citizens United Supreme Court case from over a decade ago that allows special interest groups to spend limitless money on campaigns. That's essentially what we're seeing crop up in Portland. Like you said, they're called independent expenditure committees, or IEs. Unlike candidates' campaign finance accounts, these groups can collect donations of any size and spend them on campaigns that support or oppose candidates. There is one catch: candidates themselves can't coordinate with these expenditure committees, which means they operate a little differently than a candidate campaign. But they're playing an outsized role in this race because of the campaign finance limits in play.
And some of the dynamics that this is leading to are very fascinating to me, something I haven't really seen before. So there are a couple instances you've touched on, I think, where campaign consultants, who obviously are usually some of the closest advisors to, for instance, mayoral candidates, are actually stepping away from the mayoral campaigns, the formal campaigns, because they can have a lot more impact if they are running these independent expenditure committees.
Right. We've essentially seen nearly all campaign directors of the top mayoral candidates step down to run an independent expenditure to help their candidate. One of those people is Dean Nielsen. He runs a political consulting firm called CN4 Partners, and up to a few months ago was running the campaign for mayoral candidate and current city commissioner Rene Gonzalez. Here's how he explained it.
I made the decision to leave Rene Gonzalez's campaign and to start up an independent effort on his behalf, because it's the only way that you're going to raise enough money to communicate to voters.
And just to give you a sense of the kind of money we're talking about, Nielsen said that for a city of Portland's size during a presidential election year, a mayoral candidate needs about $1 million to run a decent campaign. Gonzalez, who is participating in the city's donation matching program, he's raised about just over $300,000 so far in his campaign over the course of a year. And Nielsen's expenditure has nearly matched that in just 2 months. So they probably aren't going to reach that 1 million mark, but it's doubling the effort to get his name out there. And that's thanks to some huge donations, several that are $25,000 each to this expenditure account.
So Portland voters are now getting used to independent expenditure committees in these local elections. Let's just flag, as we have before, that voters across the state are very, very likely to see all this come into play in a few short years, because we have campaign finance limits that will kick in for state races in 2027. Oregon, pretty much anyone you talk to will say IE committees are about to become major forces in a way they've never been in this state. And that has led to criticisms in the state legislature and elsewhere from folks who think, this is a step back. Campaign money is best housed with a candidate who can craft their own messages and talk to voters with the money, as opposed to kicking that to some committee that actually isn't even supposed to be talking to the candidate. And that is also a criticism you found here in Portland, right?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, every person running an independent expenditure campaign hates that they have to, or at least that's what they've told me. They say that candidate-run campaigns are just way more effective than an independent expenditure committee. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, I would trust a candidate telling me what their whole deal is over some mysterious committee telling me to vote for them. I think it's just kind of human nature. You want the actual person there. Doug Moore runs a political group called United for Portland that has formed an independent expenditure committee to support business-friendly, moderate council candidates in Portland. He's one of the people who told me that campaign finance restrictions undermine candidates' ability to run a good campaign. Here he is.
I know that one of the goals of people is to get big money out of politics, but candidates do need to be able to carry their own message. And so we need to create systems that allow candidates to do that, or there will always be independent expenditures.
It's an interesting argument against campaign finance limits in general, or at least against really strict limits to Portland's financing program.
One of the things you see with IEs on the federal level, which I always think are just kind of eye-rolly, is something called red boxing. So congressional candidates will sort of secret a bit of messaging on their own websites that say, voters would really benefit from hearing this message via mailers,
signal.
via TV. It's just this very apparent, like, I'm not technically maybe talking to the IE committee, but here's exactly what I want this IE committee to do. And I just think we are on the course now in Portland, and we will be in the state to start seeing that same exact kind of thing.
I am curious kind of the limits of this, don't collaborate with a candidate if you have an IE kind of messaging, because I feel like there's just like a wink there. Like, there's got to be, especially if it's like the former directors of these campaigns running their IE campaigns, like they're still in touch. There's
How can you even police it? I mean, it just feels, feels a little insane.
It's odd. Anyways, Dirk, let's turn to another story entirely. We woke up Monday to learn that ballot boxes have been set on fire.
Yeah, that's right. So we learned Portland police were called out at 3:30 a.m. Monday to a fire at a ballot box in inner southeast Portland, actually right outside of Multnomah County Elections headquarters. And then a half hour later, Vancouver police were called to a separate fire, this one at a ballot box at the Fisher's Landing Transit Center. That's really the sort of southeast corner of Vancouver, Washington. What we learned was that these were pretty sophisticated acts. They used what police have called an incendiary device in every case that were attached, I guess, by magnets to the outside of these ballot boxes. They sort of superheated up the boxes until the ballots caught on fire. This was not just someone dropping a match into a ballot box. This was something else entirely. One of these ballot boxes, actually, that was at Multnomah County headquarters later that day, sort of on display for a press conference, had all these singes on it and then a hole in it that almost looked like it had been drilled. I was asking folks there, and they were kind of cagey with me, but they said, no, that was just a result of the heat, and the device sort of bored this hole somehow into the box. So it's not entirely clear how it worked to me, but more sophisticated than you might think when you say ballot boxes were set on fire.
Right, not just like a Molotov cocktail thrown in.
Yeah.
And it turned out that Monday wasn't the first time this has happened, right?
Yeah, so what we also learned was that there was a separate, I'll call it an attack, an arson attempt, whatever, on a Vancouver ballot box weeks earlier, actually on October 8th, that apparently involved a similar device. Now, that attack was unsuccessful, but police at the local, federal, and state level are all looking into it. They say all these things were connected. This is Mike Benner. He's a spokesman for the Portland Police Bureau.
There was enough evidence collected at all three scenes that lead us to believe that all three incidents are connected, and we cannot get into more detail.
Very typical of police not to get into more detail.
Never detail.
One other notable piece of these arsons is the timing, right? These devices were placed at the end of a weekend when officials sometimes don't always pick up ballots as frequently, right? That meant more ballots in the boxes almost certainly than there might have been at another time. For instance, in the case of that Vancouver ballot box, the last pickup before the fire was 11 a.m. Saturday morning, which was roughly 40 hours before the arson. A lot of time for people as the election nears to drop off their ballots. So as you can imagine, Alex, this has put people on very high alert that more attacks could be coming.
Yeah. So 3 incidences here, 2 involving ballots set on fire. What does that mean for the voters whose ballots were in these boxes?
Yeah, very different in the 2 incidents. So in Portland, nearby security guards at the elections headquarters noticed the fire quickly. I guess they heard something. There are also fire suppressants within ballot boxes. I guess they're like canisters containing powder that when things get really hot, they blow and can tamp down a fire. So those deployed, and that meant just 3 ballots were damaged, but not so damaged that election officials couldn't read whose ballots they were. So those voters have all been given new ballots. Presumably, nothing changes there. In Vancouver, damage was a lot more extensive. We were told on Monday hundreds of ballots were destroyed. We learned today from the auditor there who runs elections that something like almost 500 ballots were damaged, but they could read the name of the person, so those people will receive new ballots. It's not clear how many additionally were completely destroyed and just sort of ash. Officials in Clark County are telling voters who used that ballot box, that Fisher's Landing ballot box, after 11 a.m. on Saturday to contact them for a replacement ballot, even if they haven't been contacted. If they do, they can still vote and be counted. So theoretically, that doesn't change the vote much there either. And let's note, Alex, this is part of Washington's 3rd congressional district, huge, tight swing race between Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez and Joe Kent. So that one is obviously a very interesting location. Even if everyone whose ballot was impacted gets to cast a ballot, this is something election officials are obviously taking very, very seriously. I think they're a little shocked by it. Tim Scott is the Multnomah County Elections Director. Here's part of what he said at a press conference this week.
I've been with Multnomah County Elections for 16 years. I've been in elections for 22 years. This is the first time any incident has occurred, as far as I'm aware, at the elections building or in any position I've ever held.
And we heard something similar from Greg Kimsey, who's the top election official in Clark County, has been around for, I think, 26 years. Never seen anything like this. And as you know, Alex, Oregon and Washington have a very long history of using mail-in ballots exclusively or drop boxes like this. So the fact that this is the first time these longtime officials have seen something like this, I think, pretty notable.
We heard the Portland police spokesman talking a moment ago about evidence they collected. On Tuesday, the New York Times first reported one possible aspect of that evidence that could point to motive here. Tell me about that.
Yeah, and it's something that we don't have a lot of clarity on, so let's just be clear about that. But what the Times reported, citing unnamed law enforcement folks, was that all three of the devices had a message to the effect of "Free Gaza" written on them. And obviously, if true, that would suggest perhaps that whoever did this had some sort of protest in mind over the Israel-Gaza war and the U.S.'s role in it or lack of role in it. But the Times also said officials were still trying to determine whether any message like that communicated an actual motive or was
Just
it
a
maybe
false flag.
Yeah, exactly, an attempt to mislead. In a press conference on Wednesday, Portland law enforcement wouldn't comment on the Times report. There's another ABC News report on the existence of any of those messages. And obviously, we should note here that ballot drop boxes have gotten more and more attention, really, since 2020. That year, mail and absentee voting exploded because of COVID. You couldn't do in-person voting as easily. They have really been the focus of conspiracy theorists, particularly those who question the results of that 2020 presidential election, who see them as a source of potential insecurity, possibly a way to rig elections. I mean, there's just nothing is simple, obviously, in politics these days. There's a lot here, a lot possible, any number of things.
Many conspiracies. So we know that police are looking for a vehicle connected to this case. It's a dark-colored Volvo from the early 2000s that was spotted at the Portland fire. Dirk, beyond searching for these arsonists, what else are officials doing?
Yeah, and that's right about the vehicle. Actually, yesterday, police now offered more information about the suspect. They say they're looking for a white male between 30 and 40 with very short hair, maybe balding, thin or medium build.
So they're looking for you.
Potentially, except for, they say they also are looking for a person who is highly knowledgeable about metal fabrication or welding, and I can assure you, Alex, that is not me.
On the record.
But anyway, beyond looking for this person, police in Portland and Vancouver say they will step up patrols around ballot boxes to make sure they're going by there. Actually, election workers in Clark County plan to monitor drop boxes there. I think there's 22 or something, 24/7 until Election Day. And Clark County also said it would ramp up the pace of ballot pickups at drop boxes to limit damage if there's other attacks. Multnomah County hasn't announced any plans like that. I think they are pretty happy with the limited amount of damage in the attack.
Yeah. Well, Dirk, since this might be the last podcast we do before Election Day, we should also point out that turnout has been very slow so far, at least in Multnomah County.
Yeah, and there are signs that this could change. I'm sure it will change, but you're right. It is remarkably low, at least as of the numbers we saw yesterday. We are recording this on Thursday. As of October 30th, yesterday, something like 25% of Multnomah County ballots had been returned, which is far less than 4 years ago, also less than 2016. Statewide, almost, but not quite 30% of ballots had been returned, which was also trailing. We heard actually from Multnomah County Elections Director Tim Scott yesterday that ballots had begun to come in at far higher rates. There is certainly an expectation that a lot of people will participate in this election. I don't think anyone can say why this is lower than past years.
I think I can put in a hypothetical. I think because of the local races, having ranked choice voting, having 30 people on your ballot, having to sift through that, people are really wanting to make time to sit down and really pour through their ballot in the voter's guide before they just toss a ballot in the mail.
I will be transparent with you. I haven't voted yet, Alex. And there's also the note that it used to be that, you had to have a ballot in authorities' hands by Election Day if you mailed it. Now you just need the postmark. It's easier than ever for people to sort of procrastinate and still get their ballot counted. So probably a factor there too. Let's also note, though, that we have heard a lot of messaging in the last few days about possible Election Day disruptions, unrest, and how people are preparing for that. So elected officials from all sorts of governments in Portland and civic groups released a letter Tuesday urging Portlanders to demonstrate peacefully. This message is basically, we've come a long way after the pandemic and the unrest of 2020 to climb out of this hole. We've still got a long way to go. Please don't risk that based on whatever happens in the 2016 election. Obviously, in 2016, when Donald Trump became president, there was a number of sort of violent or destructive protests, and in 2020 we saw plenty of that. Then the police held a press conference yesterday saying they have been preparing for months for the possibility of unrest. I think you reported that earlier this year that they've recreated their crowd control unit. I forget what they call it, but something to handle protests or even what they would call riots. So they are saying they're working with civic groups. They're working with all sorts of aspects of governance. They feel really, really ready to tackle whatever is coming. And we will see if that's the case. There is a very palpable worry that this election could lead to this type of violence or property damage that Portland has seen. So I guess on that optimistic note, several days before the election, Alex, we will end there for today. It was a pleasure, as always, to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week, post-election, with more news from across the Pacific Northwest, probably results-oriented. If you don't want to wait, though, for pre-election, you're still filling out your ballot, anything like that, check out all of OPB's election coverage at opb.org/election. You'll find stories, videos, even comics explaining the biggest races of the year. While you're there, why not become an OPB member? You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.